Hi everyone. Today we are going to talk about the information processing model and the schema theory. So if we look at the overview of our presentation and the learning objectives for today, so we'll talk about the information processing model briefly because we have already talked about it in the beginning of our class. Then we will discuss in some detail about the schema theory. We'll talk about the basics, take some of the examples, talk about some of the characteristics, and then try to make a connection between the two models. And we'll summarize the key findings of our talk by the end of the presentation. So if we look at the information processing model, it has been a very clear and simple model where we always have input in the form of different commands, and then it goes to the CPU and gets either stored in the hard disk, or if it's required it'll come as an output on the screen. So our memory works on the same guidelines, which technically means that we can have a lot of inputs in our environment. It can be in the form of audio inputs, can be in the form of video inputs, sometimes a combination of these audio and visual stimuli. Although there are other senses as well, but for the sake of this discussion, I'll just concentrate on the audio and visual stimuli. So once we have all these stimuli, it goes into the sensory memory component, which for psychologists they call it as the working memory. Now, because the information around us is humongous, so not everything will be processed from the sensory memory to the working memory. So a lot of information to which we won't pay attention gets lost. And the information can be processed in the form of iconic memory if it's a visual one, or in the form of echoic memory if it's the auditory one. So whatever information we pay attention will go into the working memory. And in the working memory, it's a very short, we can only store very short pieces of information, 7 plus minus 2. That's a number which is given in most of the books and the videos which I have watched. And that depends upon a lot of factors, depending upon our age, or maybe how much prior knowledge we have about that information. And if that information is important, then it will be encoded into the long-term memory. And this is going to happen via two processes, which is the auditory information. It just moves via phonological loop, and if it's the visual information, it moves via visuospatial loop. And as I've talked before, that there is a combination of information. There is information which is a combination of these two. For that, we have the central command, which works via episodic buffer and transfer this into the long-term memory. Now, once this information is there in the long-term memory, it can be either explicit or implicit. Explicit means that it's a very general info. It's a very specific information. For example, memories of events, facts, numbers, so which can be defined very clearly, specifically, or as the name suggests, explicitly. On the contrary, implicit memory is about information which we can express very clearly. For example, we know how to learn a bicycle ride, but it's difficult to define the steps, that how much pressure we are putting on the pedals and how we are maintaining the balance while riding a bicycle. So that's about implicit memory. Now, keeping this information processing model in mind, which actually compares our memory system with a computer, let's move on to the schema theory. Now, when we talk about schema theory, the biggest question is what is schema theory? Now, if I want to define it in one sentence, I can say that it is how our mind organizes information or knowledge or memories. So it is about organization, characterization, or making similar keeping similar blocks together. Now, usually whenever we talk about these theories, they are related to most of the times to the person who has postulated them. However, this theory has been the credit for this theory has been given to few people. For example, Bartlett in 1920s, Paget in 19 at the same time, I think 20 to 30s, and this is followed by the work of Vygotsky. So a lot of people worked on the prior information and they just refine and modify it. Now, after understanding just a bit about schema theory, let's see what is schema. As I have pointed out in the beginning, schema is basically a collection or a cluster of similar pieces of information in the brain. And I have used the wrong term brain. It has to be mind, because brain is most of the times an organic organ which has all kinds of biological components, for example, neurons, neural connections, neurotransmitters, which can be defined very clearly. However, mind is something which works more on a perceptual basis. So whatever things we have in our surroundings, our brain perceives them, and it just puts the similar pieces of information into different chambers. This is about schema and schema theory. Now, I was watching a video on schema theory and they have used a metaphor of a file cabinet, and I found it very interesting as well as very informative and makes schema theory pretty clear to me. So I just thought to share it with you. So they said that, the whole cabinets which are there everywhere is our mind. And if we open individual cabinets, we have similar files kept together. So these files have information, and once similar things are kept together, these cabinets form kind of schema. So this is a metaphor which they have used to define schema theory more. Now, let's try to correlate this schema theory, what we have learned so far, with our information processing model of our memory, which was based on a computer. So we can talk about computer as a whole as our mind. And if you just click on my computer icon, then you have big folders which gets opened. And if it's an organized computer, hopefully, then all the similar pieces of files are kept in specific folders. So these specific folders are kind of schema in our brain. And if we click on individual folder, of course, then we have a lot of files, which is information. So if we try to connect the schema model with the information processing model, both are receiving information. Now, if it's the information processing model, it just stores the information just like our brain does. If it's required, it's retrieved as an output. If it's required directly as an output, it's there. To some extent, schema is doing the same thing. It's keeping information. The only difference is that unlike brain, it is about mind, and it is keeping similar information in different chunks or clusters at the same place just to make it more organized. And this organization has certain advantages as far as our day-to-day life is concerned, and we will see that in just a moment. Now, to elaborate this concept of schema more, I thought to give a few examples of schema of places and events just to make this theoretical concept more practical, I guess. So if you see at these pictures, the first picture is about what comes to your mind when you see this picture. You can see an elephant, and I'm sorry it's not very clear, but it's a picture of a safari. So if you see a safari, people, moving in vehicles within the jungle, and you can see them surrounded with animals, then whatever information you have about Safari and all those, events, then your brain try to collect all that information to comprehend the information which you are seeing right now. If you see the second picture, it looks like a huge tech city where you have tall buildings, skyscrapers, a lot of technology developed, a lot of 4Gs, 5Gs working everywhere, lots of lights and electronic gadgets used. So, whatever your brain has knowledge which depends upon media, which depends upon television, which depends upon people you meet, it just gathers all the sources and try to get maximal output from the current information, keeping in mind what you know from before. The same thing is applicable to events. If you see this picture, you can see that a wedding is going on, and you have to behave in a certain way if you go to a wedding because it's a happy event. And I'm saying it's a happy event because I want to compare it with a funeral. Because if you go to a funeral, you know what are the etiquettes of a funeral and what are the ways in which you are expected to behave in a funeral. So, whatever prior knowledge we have about a certain place, a certain event, or even certain people which I have not highlighted here, that information will simultaneously come out in order to help you cope with the current situation well. And keeping the schema, the meaning of schema, schema theory, and these examples, let's talk about a few characteristics of schema. Now, I have already covered this information, it's just a reiteration. So, basically, the main idea is to comprehend new information as easily or as lucidly as possible. Because if you are seeing something for the very first time, if you have no idea, it takes a lot of effort on our mind to process it, to learn it, to know how to do it. For example, if you've brought a new gadget, you don't know how to deal with it, then it takes a lot of time to sort out all the functions which are there inside. However, if you've been using that similar sort of gadget, the prior information which you have about it will make will make your task pretty simple. And that's what it said in the second point, that it makes sense of complex information, means whatever information we have in our brain, in that particular file or cabinet of our brain, it just comes out as a whole and try to, decipher what is there now. And this is, I found it very interesting, and this was, by the way, also discussed in the same video which I have watched on schema theory. So they said that people have a generalization about things. For example, if you see a picture of a high-tech city, then you have certain notions about it. And these notions, not about places, but especially about people, are hard to change. Although it can be changed, but it is difficult. So if you have a preconceived notion, perception about something, whenever you come across that thing, you will just think on those lines. And even if it's not like the way which you perceive, you still don't want to, change your perception. So these generalizations are hard to change. This is one of the interesting characteristics of schema theory, I believe. Now, whatever we have talked so far about information processing model and schema theory, let's try to bring them together and try to see what are the common things. So if we tie these two things together, this diagram I feel really defined things well. So if we talk about the information processing model, it compares our brain with a computer where inputs are coming and then they are processed in the brain. Although one of the drawbacks of information processing theory was it won't tell us that it won't exactly tell us how this information is processed. And the same thing is true for the schema theory as well, that we exactly don't know that how this pieces or chunks of information gets settled into specific folders of similar sort. We don't know exactly the method of processing, neither in the brain nor in the mind. However, we know that information is coming, It's processed, stored, and if it's needed, as in the form of an output, there it is retrieved. Here also, once it's required, you can just, it's, maybe, I don't know, retrieval is the right word for schema theory or not, but somewhere the same information comes up and it helps us to comprehend new information. So coming of information, storing it in different fashions, and using it once it's needed are the common things which happens between information processing model and schema theory. All right, to wind up this presentation, let's see what we have talked so far. We have talked about the information processing model, what it is, how it's connected to a computer. Then we talked about schema theory. We talked about what is schema theory, who discovered it, what schema exactly means. I tried to give a couple of examples of a few places, a few events where schema theory can work. I've also talked about some of the characteristics of schema theory based on the places and the events we have talked. And then I just combine information processing model and the schema theory just to decipher that what exactly are the similarities between the two. I hope this is a kind of a very brief overview of the topic. It's not in a lot of detail. There's a huge chunk of information given in the books, articles, and videos online. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'll be more than happy to answer them. Thank you very much.